Now, I'm not necessarily a braggadocio type, but what I will say here is that it's worth basking a little bit in adulation around the correct prediction that I did have. And I think for anyone with any instinct or sense, it was simplicity itself to understand what the outcome was going to be. I talk a lot about electability, and I think a lot of the times people don't quite comprehend exactly what that means and how Trump is very electable, whereas Kamala and Waltz are not electable. You would say that JD Vance is not quite electable yet. He doesn't have a strong enough platform and position. He hasn't got the gravitas just yet. His demeanor is still of that pubescent, underdeveloped, not quite matured visage that we would expect out of a strong leader type, which he's trying to emulate. So the census is out dependent on whether he can achieve and mature into that type of role, into that person in his now 4 years that he'll be having as VP. But I think electability is a very important concept, and in this video I can delve into why it was so easy to understand the matter at hand, that Trump is electable, that before him Joe Biden was seen as electable, and the opposite being true with Hillary not being an electable and a very unlikable person, as Kamala being less unlikable than Hillary, but more of a nobody. She's got a very blank persona, and there's nothing to her. And I compared a lot in previous videos to the physiognomy of the candidates, and in that you can obviously see the appeal between, juxtapose Trump to Kamala, and that one has a very strong and ardent appeal, and the other one has less, going in the way of potentially uniqueness, but also the gravitas, I think is the best way to put it. Do you see this person as a leader? And to what extent can you assume that they'll be strong enough in the face of adversity? Like you can already imagine Trump being a successful businessman, and he's previously been president, where you ran a fairly rubberneck and I would say incompetent boob against him, then you'll get this result 10 times out of 10. I'm not sure how the biased media was even able to justify the 50-50. I think a lot of them had this anticipation that it was going to be a close race, and that's also a bit of a fallacious argument here, because when we understand about statistics and analytics is that there's a much better way to grasp the probability of certain things, and that is particularly in terms of whether the voting patterns will bear out from data into reality. And anyone who had any sense around this could have seen just from demographic data that the countryside or rural, regional, sub-regional and suburban were almost all going to go to Trump in areas where there's no demographic diversity. And these were mostly of the swing states. I think the only surprise state was Georgia, and in that's probably more of a anti-appeal to Kamala than it necessarily is a Trump winning it from his own regards. I think when there's a very poor candidate, you have lower turnouts, and from lower turnout, lower enthusiasm. So she probably lost 3-4% of the total vote in the inability of her own demeanor to attract and project that desire in people's hearts to say, come out, actually spend your time today choosing me. She never really wanted it. You could tell she was never really in it. She wasn't doing the things we expect people who want to win do. And from that, I think we can delve into this really nice quote by Ernst Junger, where he's saying, in politics as in life, instinct is superior to intelligence. And like him or not, Trump is definitely a man of good instincts. He has, I would say, superlative interpersonal and marketing or branding instincts, in that he projects himself and markets himself in the exact way that he wants to. And he's very calculated with this. I don't necessarily enjoy listening to his speeches. I think his ability to weave can be good, but I think in alternative, in many circumstances, it can be very annoying to listen to. And this maybe is why he's very, he has high appeal amongst, you might call it, lower socioeconomic and potentially lower IQ voters, because they really appreciate his ability to hammer home in very simple sentences ideas and concepts which are nebulous or ephemeral to the degree of stronger borders. It's a policy you hear and you instinctually think of something that might happen from that. There's no core policy of what that means, and you can say build the wall, and then people will know that you're trying to build the wall, but the pragmatic and actual effects of such a policy is one of those deeper questions that most of the polity don't care too much about. So that's why Trump is very effective, obviously. He's able to attune himself to that verve and then interact on their level in a way that he's able to, I would say, almost transcend this IQ bell graph. But in doing so, I think he establishes what we can think of as a very important topic, and that's on the totem or in something like iconography, symbolism. So Trump is very strong in designing and building images of himself. He wears his suits and his hair and his fake tan, his veneers, or there's everything calculated about his appearance. And on top of that, his gesticulations, the way he interacts, his sanguine attitude, which is such a, you would say, refreshing way, because it's very earnest. Oscar Wilde wrote a book about this, or a play, and which I think is timeless in many ways, and there is an importance to being earnest. And you feel that with Trump. I think that's why a lot of people have a distaste for him. Most strong men are very polarizing. You're very milquetoast if people feel neither if they're ambivalent, basically. If people are ambivalent about you, then that's a bad sign. And I would take that as you're not built to be a leader, because people have to hate, or the ability to hate and love leaders, which is not possible for people who stir no emotion in someone. And we can glean from that then that Trump is obviously a very strong personality and not this Kamala-style civil servant who is a nobody and a no-name, who's been thrust upon stage as a marionette. So from this, we can obviously draw a lot of parallels, and I think it's not even unfair to draw parallels to strong dictator types, in the way that I can see the analogy in that there's a personal appeal. He is a populist. And populism is a dirty word, obviously, because we had many populists in the 20th century who besmirched the title. But in general, populists are just popular and by nature appeal to a broad range of people for reasons that are usually not just policy. They include policy, but are not limited to that. And I would say that this once again comes down to his ability to propagandize or establish an icon as an icon himself. His totem-esque a way to establish his brand in your face and in your memory, searing himself indelibly as images into how you think of him and what he's done. And I've shown 3 here, which encapsulate 3 different elements and scenarios in which he's found himself in the last 5 years, or whenever it was he took the photo. But it just in general shows you that he's a very affable and funny guy. He's got a large level of humor. He's particularly good at standing there and speaking and making jokes. His delivery is quite good. He's also very funny on Twitter, or at least used to be on X, or whatever it's called. And so for him, I think that's his day-to-day personality. Then obviously underneath that, bearing all that weight of his amiability, is this strong man who's capable, if push comes to shove, to kill or be killed. And that's what we like in the appeal. This goes into that Caesar-esque element that I've talked about. And if you think that Caesar was obviously a much better general and had his ability to project actual force through arms and lead men into battle, and had conquered quite a lot of continental Europe doing so, Gaul and Britain, then you can obviously feel like Trump is inadequate to be a comparison. But that's also because Caesar came much later in the Caesar period in that Sulla was what we could consider the first Caesar, and that even the Gracchus brothers in the 2nd century BC were also important populist figures in a way very similar to Trump. So that time period as it overlaps from Gracchus to Sulla is where we find ourselves now. And if Trump is the Sulla, it's less important that he resembles in that machismo way, or the chauvinist way of Caesar being a man of arms and army, because we understand Trump to be a businessman, and his selflessness in going into politics is obviously a double-barreled goal for him, in that he wants to help the world in his vision, but he also wants to obtain power, because having his life is dictated by money before this, and treasure as a concept can become very stale and ossifying to a soul. If all you care about is money, you get very materialist cultures that we're all familiar with, particularly in the Middle East and Africa and Asia, where once there's an obsession with money, it drives men and women into this monomaniacal must grind and pursue a number at any cost, not in the soulful way of the Faustian sense of treasure and treasure hunting and gathering and hoarding, but in a just very pecuniary transactional way. And this is why there's such a distinction between the two philosophies, and why for Trump it became such a burdensome existence to be the nobody other than the rich billionaire from New York, but leveraging that into what is now obviously a very impressive political career. So his ability, as I say, to project this image onto our brains and into our minds and conceptualize him in this almost archetypal way is what being and becoming a Caesar is about. He's able to win the power and win the will of the people, and in the most important country in the world. And that's, I think, evident in the result that you saw in the election, as rightly predicted by yours truly, very humbly so. And it also should say to you that the idea behind Caesar is less of a man, but the content and the character of what a man can do in his aims and ambit, and how we generate this projection, or we generate an image, a holographic image almost of ourselves outwards towards the world, and they take that on the value that it possesses for them. Do you inspire people? Are you able to be the bedrock or the redoubt for these people's safety and their well-being? Can they see you as that protector, as that leader, as that Viking chief? Is that something that you are able to do? And I think we can look to the transformational turning point, and a lot of people here like to point to 9/11, and they think, okay, so there's a fundamental shift in how we consider politicians from this elite class of civil servants or lawyers who have a name behind them which is meaningful to people because previously their relatives have been meaningful people. So if it's a Roosevelt is your last name, or it's a Bush that's your last name, this is some importance to and there's an assurance and a trust around this. But I would consider the lack of our ability to care for this type of methodology of picking a politician anymore comes down to internet, and it also comes down to what we consider a leader more cerebrally. Now, before, leaders and politicians were stuffy civil servants. We chose them and their ability to manage and be in this managerial class. And for me, and this is going to sound a little bit facetious or asinine, but for me, there was a massive shift around techno-Viking and the advent of the internet. So something like a meme had not existed to this extent before. You would have to catch something on TV, on the radio, for it to sit there as a mimetic force, a kernel that is transmitted between everybody, that's as a shared understanding. But once the internet, the purveyor of images in ways that it's obtainable for everyone at any point in time, eternally, in perpetuity, shows you what it means to everyone to instinctually understand something as simple as a fearsome warrior. And in a way that's very atavistic. There is a primal understanding of this guy, this man who stood there at a silly music festival in Berlin in his countenance of very threatening yet still, you call it not heartwarmingly protective, but in the sense a secure and formidable warrior type. And in that, from just stemming from that, we have had a cascading effect and a snowball almost of what it is to be considered the Faustian warrior archetype man in this century and going forward. It is almost a callback to our ancestral periods, whereby we now actually, in an age of guns and warfare and nuclear weapons, where there is no eye-to-eye contact between the enemies who are killing each other, that we go in society back to the basics of, does this man look like he could tear me apart with my bare hands? And then on the opposite side, I think it's been super detrimental. So it's been, I would say, almost a good thing in the modern age to have social media for men, because it's aspirational in a lot of ways, that you can see what you would could become through other men's lives. You have this hero and ability to understand what a hero in your own archetype could look like. You have that ability to call it up on the internet. You don't have to stumble upon it in a book in a library in dusty tomes. And you have pictures, and you have this drive, this motivational pull. Except for women, this is the opposite. And unfortunately for women in the social media age, you have a surfeit of freedoms and options. But the problem with options for people who are mostly capable only of binary choices is you have this paralysis by analysis by paralysis, or the inability to make a decision because you're scared of the opportunity cost of that decision. And so when you think of it as a Markov chain, it's less of a probability for something, but more of a closing doors, and that once one is open or closed, then it's less likely you'll be able to go back through. And so you have the realm of the feminine realm basically be populated by these spooks now. And there's a lot of issues, I would say, to be a woman in this century. It's not easy, and you find yourself in comparative lives across the spectrum. And for men, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm also compared, it's really tough. But that's good. It should be tough. You should be compared as a man. There should be this will to fight. You need to be able to show that you're better than the other men. And it's natural. So the more you can attune this extreme version of survival of the fittest, the better you get as a man. And if you quit, then that's a good example of why you would never going to win, and that you just wanted something handed to you. If men want it, they'll go and get it. That's what we've fundamentally understood about humanity, and what we've been getting away from for 200 years, since the 1800s to now, is that men have had less and less need to be different, and it's been easier to earn a living and easier to have a wife and kids because you could just pay for it with your brain activity. But now we're reverting back to that's not good enough. Just because you have money, you actually have to have other things. And that if you have money, you have to have a lot of it. And having a lot of money is not easy. It's not this simple basic get a job and then you've got everything sorted. So this has actually been a good thing, in my opinion, about the modern age for men. It's unfortunately the inverse, and proportionally inverse for women, in that it's gotten much harder as a woman to maintain a certain level of psychological safety, and that making easy choices, or basic choices you maybe call them, is a nicer way to frame it, is much more difficult to do because you have considerations you never had to have before. Am I picking the right life partner becomes a much more difficult task when you have 2,000, 5,000 options versus having two. And you will make mistakes, and unfortunately be able to not relive and go back and reverse this time in a way that's meaningfully able to reset your biological clock or your love clock or whatever sort of range of feelings and cupidity that you had. And so in this, I think women just have to be extra cautious about how they live their lives, and that being chronically online for a woman is actually quite a bad thing. And I would say it's deleterious to your mental health to a substantial degree. And there are ways probably to counteract it, but in general, I think it's best to minimize and be very particular with where you interact, and that male spaces are not necessarily places you ought to or want to be online. It's not that nice to have to interact with the internal monologues and thoughts and processes of men a lot of the time. Like, men think for men in that way, whereas obviously it's much easier for a woman to communicate and think in a much smaller social circle with a bit of privacy and probity. In this, I think I've maybe continued a thread that just can be pulled back onto what it is about Trump specifically, and that he has used this internet age because he's unelectable 30 years ago. This is a guy who did consider politics in the 90s and understood that he was not capable of running in a way that was able to allow him to rise to power. He had to wait, and I'm not sure he understood the internet's ability to accelerate his ascendancy here. But in general, I think he's been fortuitous, and it's been very serendipitous for him to have lived in this age. And you can see why a 78, 79-year-old man would bother hanging on to do this, because it is the one shot and you had to wait this long for it to happen. And his life has obviously been extremely tumultuous and ups and downs, and the insane amount of experiences he's led obviously has a massive impact on how his ability to contextualize the world works. And so if you can pull across all of these experiences into one lived existence, you should theoretically be able to pick and choose the best options or the best expressions of your own attributes and your own habits, as Peirce calls them. And so I think that that also goes into, as I said before, the iconography. He's stylized himself in a way that he now can understand people will be pulled towards. America first, and I ardently still, I would aver at least, that Trump is and forever will be a blue-blooded, die-hard American. He does just genuinely love America in a earnest and patriotic way that is not at all ironic and is not at all insincere. I would say that the only thing is he's emphasized it in ways that can come across as being maybe a little bit hyperbolic, but in general, I think that that's also fine. It's what people want to hear out of someone who's going to chant America, USA, USA. We almost expect, in Europe at least, that there are Americans who are so red, blue, and white that when they bleed, it's Pepsi, Cola, and McDonald's fries. In general, though, I think it comes all the way back, and we can go very high level with this and say that the ideas Spengler has around politics and around our lived experience and our philosophy at the moment, which is purely skepticism. There is only one thought process. You can't be an optimist. You saw the Democrats just now be optimists, and it crushed them. They will be psychologically impaired and scarred for life now. It's an ineluctable journey that they've chose here, which is despair. And on the flip side, to be a pessimist, to be this black-pilled and chronically depressed almost outlook, is also the reserve of, I would say, a psychologically incomplete or immature person. There's this inability to contextualize the world around us. The celestial mechanics of how and why you're here and the majesty to it has to lead you into a positivity, or at least a neutrality. There's no way to be this kind of downtrodden, woe is always me type without it being either at a forced effort or something being biologically, mechanically wrong with you. If you have biochemistry issues, completely understood. But in saying that, the Spengler has gone in and made a lot of commentary on this. And I just took one small excerpt from Man and Technics, which is particularly a favorite of mine, where he goes on to say that the ordering of, according to species of life, which is revealed only through unsophisticated living with it, through the inwardly felt relationship of ego and two, which is known to every peasant, but also to every true artist and poet. I love to meditate upon the physiognomic of the kinds of animal living, the kinds of animal soul, leaving the systematic of bodily structure to the zoologist. For thereupon a wholly different hierarchy, one of life and not of body, discloses itself. And here Spengler is talking very much into the soul of a people, and that it can be understood more so around how we feel and interact, the magic we can embrace from someone's existence. And this is where you say aura, and not in that hippie, I can tell you've got a good aura, but in the imposing, if you turned a corner in a cave system 50,000 years ago and you saw a type of person, instinctually you knew how to react to that person. Is this a threat? Is this prey? How am I thinking? Because as we're predators, we use our eyes, and the eyes are so important in being able to understand and dictate expression, but also action. We predispose ourselves, and you might call it fight, flight, or freeze, but in this, it's the mechanical adaptation. Our aptitude to action or reaction has been so finely attuned that we do recognize greatness in people instinctually. And that's why, and I can maybe finalize here after quite a long diatribe, is to say that, firstly, I was right, so thank you very much. I was able to predict this election outcome, and I think obviously many of you would have been able to predict it, but I think I was so assured in its outcome, and this is just down to this very basic act of physiognomic iconography, symbology, and then also the spiritual soul of an electable person versus a non-electable person. I think secondarily, you should consider how your own persona, your own aura is interacting with everyone around you and what you are projecting yourself onto as. It's one thing to think of yourself as something, but if everyone's interacting with you in a way that isn't coherent, it's not congruent to how you feel you are, then you will be this mixed up, but an incomplete person. And it's not even the shadow that's being reflected from a Jungian sense, but it's a general mismatch between your own perception of reality and reality. You need to attune yourself to the same verve, as I say. And then thirdly, I think it's about your instincts, making sure that you have become a man who puts himself in positions where you can adapt and build them. Instincts are natural in that you'll have a basic level of them, but they become perfected with use. And so knowing when and when not to do something, knowing how and how not to do something, can be just this very basic heuristic and a reflexive habit. And then that should be your, at least if you've got a 2025 goal or you've got some coherent plan for yourself that you want to get somewhere in life, something, have this all-encompassing desire. Are you this treasure seeker, or are you this power-hungry despo in waiting? Then you channel that into those things, and that's how you become the successful person that you ought to be.